The night air over San Francisco carried that expensive chill that only comes from a rooftop wrapped in glass and champagne. The Fairmont skyline terrace glowed in candlelight and money strings of gold bulbs. The low hum of a jazz trio. Waiters sliding through the crowd with trays of rosé. Everything looked curated, the monogrammed napkins, the slate gray suits, the laughter that rose and fell exactly on cue. It was our 7th wedding anniversary. Elliot Ward, my husband, co-founder of Verdant Capital, stood at the center of it all, the city stretching behind him like a personal empire. I had spent the afternoon checking the seating chart, approving the flower balance, making sure the trust's investors were seated next to the journalists he wanted to impress. To the world. We were the power couple that made sustainability glamorous. I wore a deep green silk dress, the shade of his company's logo, the one a stylist insisted would photograph well. Inside my small clutch, folded into an envelope marked personal, lay a single document, Verdant Capital Trust Agreement, Amendment 17B. My thumb brushed its edge now and then, like a pulse check, though I didn't yet know why I'd brought it. The speeches had been predictable, his partner toasting vision and integrity, a reporter describing our marriage as the beating heart of a green empire. I smiled on cue, the way political spouses do. Then Elliot lifted his glass again. A microphone appeared in his hand, offered by the event coordinator, who looked relieved that the night was nearly over. He didn't look at the guests. He looked straight at me. "If I could redo one thing in my life," he said, voice steady, calm, amplified across the skyline, "I wouldn't marry you." For a full second. No one moved. The sound vanished, the piano cut mid-note. The chatter collapsed into vacuum. I remember a woman's nervous laugh quickly swallowed. A champagne flute slipped from someone's hand and shattered against marble. Dozens of faces turned toward me, searching for context, for humor, for anything that made sense. I gave them nothing. Elliot set the microphone back onto the stand, adjusted his cufflinks, and turned toward the panoramic glass as if the city lights were the only audience he cared about. "Enjoy the rest of your evening," he added lightly, then walked off the small platform and disappeared through the terrace doors. No one followed him. They watched me the way crowds always do when someone's left standing. The hum returned, low and confused. Someone whispered my name. My mother-in-law's hand flew to her pearls, the PR manager mouthed. "Should I say something?" The jazz trio looked frozen in a single, wrong note. I smoothed the skirt of my dress. My hands were dry, steady. The trust document pressed against the silk lining of my clutch like a heartbeat. I didn't break. My voice murmured somewhere between my ribs and my mind. I recalculated. I turned to the guests. 100 expectant faces caught between pity and voyeurism, and said the only thing that sounded civilized, "Please, enjoy the party." Then I walked slow. Deliberate past the tables, past the photographers lowering their cameras in confusion, past the dessert cart with its perfectly aligned macarons that suddenly looked absurd. The elevator doors closed behind me with a hiss that sounded like applause. My reflection looked composed, detached a mannequin dressed for resilience. The elevator music crackled a string cover of Can't Help Falling in Love. I nearly laughed at the irony. By the time I reached the lobby, messages were already lighting my phone. "Are you okay?" "What happened?" He didn't mean it. "Right." I silenced them all. Outside. The city was wet from a mist that hadn't turned to rain. The street smelled of eucalyptus and expensive perfume. A black car waited our driver, confused but professional. "Home. Mrs. Ward?" he asked. "Not yet," I said. My voice sounded perfectly calm, as if ordering coffee. "Take me to the office." He hesitated, then nodded. The car pulled away from the hotel, leaving behind the faint echo of gossip rising through the rooftop air. I sat in the dark leather seat, replaying the moment frame by frame, the tilt of Elliot's head, the precision of his tone, the way he hadn't looked angry or drunk, just prepared. Public humiliation wasn't impulse. It was choreography. That meant there was a script, and scripts leave paper trails. I reached into my clutch and unfolded the document. Amendment 17B shimmered faintly under the passing streetlights. I hadn't read it carefully when he'd slipped it into the trust package a month ago. He'd called it routine housekeeping. Tonight the words looked different in the event of material marital change. Beneficiary rights may be reassigned at trustee's discretion. Material marital change, a public declaration that he wished he'd never married me, would that count? My pulse steadied. Every humiliation has a ledger. Every betrayal. A line item. I'd spent years drafting those clauses for other people. I could read one in my sleep. When the car stopped at Verdant Capital's darkened headquarters, I sat a moment longer before stepping out. The city lights blinked across the bay like an open spreadsheet, rows of windows, columns of secrets. Somewhere inside that skyline was the reason he'd needed witnesses tonight. I slipped the paper back into my clutch and smiled to no one. He thought he'd closed the book. He'd only turned the page. If you were standing there, on that rooftop, hearing your partner erase you in front of everyone you knew, what would you do? Would you beg for context? Or would you start calculating your next move? Tell me in the comments below. From the outside, our lives looked perfectly arranged like the glossy cover of San Francisco, Modern Living that once featured our home. The caption read, "The Ward's Building. Green Empires and Lasting Love." At the time. I'd laughed. The magazine hadn't asked to photograph the silence between us. We lived in Pacific Heights, the kind of neighborhood where every front door looked freshly repainted, and the houses wore their wealth like tailored suits, every morning. Elliot read market updates aloud as if they were scripture. I made coffee, checked our foundation's inbox, and pretended that domestic stability was a kind of peace. Elliot was the visionary. He'd turned a Stanford MBA and a family inheritance into Verdant Capital, a venture fund that made sustainability glamorous, solar startups, ethical textiles, carbon capture software. His portfolio read like the future. I was the structure behind it. Before Verdant, I'd worked 8 years as an estate and trust paralegal at one of the city's biggest firms. My world was clauses and filings, not panels and pitches. When we married, he convinced me to leave the law firm. Why organize other people's fortunes when we can build our own at first? It worked. We complemented each other, his ambition, my precision. He spoke in headlines, I wrote the fine print. Together, we closed funding rounds that landed on TechCrunch, hosted dinners that ended in term sheets. Investors called us the green power couple, but power couples have unspoken hierarchies, and in ours. I'd started to feel the air thin above my head. His mother, Margot Ward, adored performance. Marriage is brand alignment. She told me once over lunch at the Battery. Don't think of it as love, it's a merger. Her compliments were sharp-edged. You look so polished tonight. You're finally dressing the part. She'd worked in PR for decades, and it showed. Everything, even affection. Had a talking point. My one true ally was Marian Cho, my former colleague from the law firm. Marian handled M&A deals with surgical calm. We had opposite temperaments, she skeptical. Me hopeful, but she was the first to text after the rooftop debacle. Don't react. Observe, then call me. Then there was Gabe, Verdant's CFO, brilliant and chronically loyal to Elliot. He was the type who lived on spreadsheets and protein shakes. Too focused to notice politics unless it hit his balance sheet. He'd once told me, Elliot trusts you more than anyone. I'd believed him. And finally, Mrs. Harlow, our HOA president, whose floral blazers could stop traffic. She cared more about property lines than human ones. You two make such a statement for Pacific Heights, she said once, inspecting our hedge height, a modern Camelot. I'd smiled politely, knowing Camelot ends in smoke. Our calendar was a carousel of fundraisers and investor dinners. Tuesday was usually a board pitch or an LP meeting. Thursdays, a charity gala for climate tech or education equity. I'd stand beside Elliot, the unspoken proof of stability, while he performed charm like an Olympic event. I knew which jokes landed, which stories signaled authenticity. Still, small changes had begun to collect like hairline cracks in marble. Elliot started working later, taking calls on the terrace, lowering his voice when I entered the room. He stopped asking me to review Verdant's quarterly statements, saying, "You're too detail-oriented. Claire, let's keep you focused on the narrative. The narrative that word replaced partnership." Then came the digital locks. I discovered one morning that my access to Verdant's main drive had been temporarily suspended. When I asked Gabe, he blinked and said it must be a tech glitch. The next day, the passwords were changed again. At dinner, Elliot brushed it off. We're doing some restructuring, he said between bites of steak. Cleaner chain of custody for investor docs. Standard stuff. His tone was casual, but his eyes didn't meet mine. I'd drafted those exact clauses before. They weren't standard stuff. They were containment protocols. When I pressed. He smiled the way men do when they've already decided you won't understand. You worry too much. This is good for both of us. He started inviting journalists to what used to be private celebrations, birthdays, business milestones, even our anniversary. It's brand synergy, he said. People love a love story. I watched him rehearse speeches about partnership and purpose. Those stories no longer included me, at home. He'd walk past the piano without noticing the mail on it, the invoices, the trust summaries, the HOA letters about upcoming renovations I'd never authorized. When I mentioned them, he waved a hand, delegated. You don't need to worry. It wasn't anger that grew in me. It was precision. I began to take quiet inventory of what he touched, what he moved, what he hid. One Sunday morning, while folding napkins for yet another investor's brunch, I found a note in his jacket pocket, a seating plan for our anniversary dinner. Next to media invitees, he'd written for optics full attendance. I remember sitting there, the napkin corners slipping through my hands, realizing the party wasn't about us, it was about him. A public stage. And stages need narratives. Marion had once warned me, half jokingly, never trust a man who uses storytelling as a KPI. I should have listened. By early spring, the house felt colder, though the thermostat read 72. The air carried that faint electronic hum of Secrets Bank notifications pinging after midnight, calls labeled unknown, paper shredders running too long. On the surface, we still looked immaculate. To outsiders, we were success-embodied sustainability, philanthropy, grace. But behind the mirrored doors of Pacific Heights, I'd started to see the reflection blur. When he told me he wanted reporters at our anniversary dinner, I said nothing. I nodded, adjusted the guest list, and ordered an extra floral arrangement, white orchids. Sterile and beautiful. He thought I was supportive. I was documenting. Because in my world, paper never lies. And one day soon, I'd need every line, every date, every clause. The night that followed would prove it. And by then, the room would fall silent for more than just a sentence. The first red flag came disguised as routine paperwork. It was a Tuesday morning in late April, the kind of fog-soaked San Francisco day that blurred the skyline into watercolor. Elliot appeared in the kitchen wearing his navy suit, the one that meant investors, not errands, and placed a slim folder next to my coffee. Just a procedural update, he said, pouring himself espresso. Our attorney's streamlining some trust documentation. You just need to initial where flagged. The folder was embossed with Verdant Capital Family Trust. My name printed beneath his in neat serif letters. Inside, 5 pages of dense legal text clauses about estate distribution, beneficiary hierarchy, trustee discretion. All language I'd read 1,000 times in my old job. But one line in Amendment 12C made me pause. Beneficiary reallocation upon material marital event? I looked up. What does this mean? He smiled without looking, scrolling through his phone. It's standard language. Claire, just legalese for the lawyers. You know how they are. I did know. I also knew that phrase was anything but standard. It meant that if the marriage changed separation, divorce, or even public scandal, the trustee could reassign the assets. The trustee, in this case, was him. I ran my thumb along the paper edge. Who drafted this? Gabe reviewed it, he said. Still typing? And we're having the firm notarize later today. Just sign where it's highlighted. I'm late for a meeting. The yellow tabs blinked like warning lights. I wanted to ask for the full document chain, the prior version, the attorney's comments. But his tone made it sound petty. So I signed my name. Neatly. Next to the tabs and watched him slip the folder into his briefcase as if it were already decided. That night, I told myself not to overthink it. We'd built this life together. Surely I wasn't the kind of woman who needed to read between her husband's lines. But habits die hard. At 2 a.m. When he was asleep beside me. I opened my laptop. I typed beneficiary reallocation upon material marital event into the California Trust Statute database. The results were clear. It was a reclassification clause, one that shifted ownership of assets in the event of betrayal or dissolution. I stared at the definition until the screen dimmed. By morning. My mind was quiet, but not calm. The second red flag arrived as an accident or maybe fate. I was at the office when I received a forwarded email meant for Elliot. The subject line read, "Wire confirmation, Verdant B Trust." The message was from the fund's accounting firm. Attached was a confirmation slip for a $500,000 transfer from our primary marital account into Verdant B Trust. There was only one problem: we didn't have a Verdant B Trust, at least. Not one I'd ever helped establish. I scrolled down to the footnote. Beneficiary E, Ward, sole trustee. My name was nowhere. The accountant's note read, "As per your instruction. The transfer is complete. All documentation filed under secondary trust registry." A misclick had copied me instead of his personal address. I sat back in my chair, pulse slowing, eyes tracing every line. $500,000. A secondary trust I didn't know existed. And my recent signature on Amendment 12C suddenly looked like the first domino. I forwarded the email to myself using a private account, then deleted the original from my inbox. My fingers trembled not from fear, but from clarity. That night, I said nothing. Elliot returned home late, smelling faintly of whiskey and hotel lobby flowers. He placed his phone face down on the marble counter, kissed the air near my cheek, and said, "Board dinner ran long." When he showered, I saw the call log flash across his screen, an unfamiliar number saved under Evergreen Legal LLP. The name triggered something. That was the shell firm we'd used years ago to register Verdant Capital's early assets before the main fund existed. It was dormant now, or supposed to be. Later, lying in the dark, I heard him whispering from his study. His tone was low, deliberate. I moved silently into the hallway, the oak floor cool under my bare feet. Through the crack in the door, his voice was unmistakable. "Once she's off the trust, the assets are clean." The words slid through the silence like a knife. I stood frozen, every cell in my body listening. He paused, then said, "Yes. Amendments filed. She signed. By next quarter, it's done." He ended the call, exhaled, and turned off the lamp. I slipped back into bed before he returned, eyes open, heartbeat steady. The third red flag came with the morning mail. An envelope from the Pacific Heights Homeowners Association marked urgent violation notice, exterior renovation without HOA approval. It read, "Unpermitted construction on rear extension. Fine, $12,000. I frowned. We hadn't renovated anything. The last project we'd done was a landscaping update 2 years ago. I drove by the rear alley later that afternoon and stopped cold. A set of scaffolds leaned against the back facade. A crew removing windows I'd never approved for replacement. A man in a hard hat looked up, startled. "Mrs. Ward, Mr. Ward said you signed off on the remodel." "Which remodel? The storage addition? New insulation?" "Updated wiring. Said it was part of the capital improvement plan." I glanced at the invoice taped to a nearby board, $89,000 billed to Verdant Holdings subaccount 2. The project description read, "Property upgrade for energy audit compliance." Energy audit, right. A perfect way to funnel money, disguise invoices, and justify cash movement. I thanked the foreman and left before my calm cracked. That evening, I watched Elliot pour himself a scotch while answering emails, his tie loose, his charm effortless. I almost admired the precision. He hadn't built a marriage. He'd built an exit strategy, and I had just signed the release form. He looked up from his screen. "Something wrong?" I smiled, just thinking about the remodel. He blinked. A flicker too long. "Oh, that. It's minor. You'll love it." "Of course," I said softly. "I always do." He didn't notice the folder under my arm as I left the room. Inside were copies of the HOA notice, the wire transfer, and the trust amendment with my tidy, trusting signature. Every document sounded different once you knew it was evidence. Sometimes the worst betrayals don't scream, they whisper through paperwork. 2 days after the HOA notice, I sat at the long walnut desk in our study, my laptop open to the San Francisco Recorder's office portal. It was supposed to be routine verify the remodel permit instead. One search result caught my eye. Grant deed, 2126 Broadway Street, San Francisco. Our home, filed 3 weeks earlier. At first, I thought it was a duplicate record, but when I clicked View Document, my breath caught. The property was no longer owned by Verdant Living LLC, our joint holding company. It now belonged to Elliott Ward Holdings LLC, filed electronically, notarized, signed by Claire Dalton Ward. My name. In flawless cursive, my signature. But I hadn't touched that document. I zoomed in until the pixels blurred. The slant was perfect. The pen pressure replicated. Even the flourish on the W was right. It was beautiful forgery efficient, practiced, cruelly elegant. Someone had transferred our Pacific Heights house entirely into Elliott's name using a fabricated deed. And because it had been e-signed through DocuSign, the notarization looked legitimate. He hadn't just prepared his exit, he forged it in my name. I sat there, frozen between fury and disbelief. The screen reflected my face like glass over a tombstone. That night, while he snored softly beside me, I emailed Marion a copy. Her reply arrived before dawn. You need to pull every linked filing deed, lien, and escrow trail. He's repositioning assets fast. So I did. I logged into our joint bank dashboard, the one I was supposedly too busy to monitor. The pattern was subtle but precise every Friday for the past 6 weeks. Identical transfers labeled vendor escrow $27,500 each moved out of our Verdant Living account. The destination line was almost artful in its vagueness. Verdant Offshore Subtrust, BVI. I'd seen structures like this before. In estate planning. Offshore subtrusts often masked liquid asset relocations, technically legal, strategically immoral. You don't use them for optimization, you use them for concealment. He was hiding money offshore while quietly dissolving our domestic holdings. And I'd signed one procedural update that made it all perfectly legal. I scrolled through the transactions again, tracing the rhythm of his deceit like a metronome. Every withdrawal paired with a vendor invoice construction. Audit. Consulting. Fake shells. All of them. He'd engineered an illusion of expenses while siphoning wealth through the gaps. At 2 a.m., I printed the grant deed and the escrow statement, then hid them inside the hollow base of my old law books. My heartbeat was steady, slow. Anger wasn't useful yet. Evidence was. The next day, I found another thread. Verdant's internal server housed a draft NDA folder. Accessible only to executive accounts except mine, still had a shadow credential from when I'd built the structure years ago. I opened it out of curiosity. Inside was an email chain between Elliott and Levi Crane, a name I recognized from industry panels. Levi was a high-risk investor, charismatic, reckless, and known for engineering hostile mergers. Their draft NDA had a note in red font, ensure confidentiality through merger window, spousal dilution to complete by Q3. Spousal dilution. The words hit like a physical shove. In corporate law, dilution meant reducing someone's equity stake. In marriage, it translated to erasure. I scrolled further. Levi. Once the merger finalizes, she's out clean. Write Elliott. The trust and the deed handle optics. She's compliant on paper. After the announcement, I'll file her resignation retroactively. Levi's smart. No loose ends. No loose ends. I shut my laptop and sat in the dark, the hum of the city outside sounding like distant static. That was the moment of full recognition, not shock, not sadness, just the cold. Precise understanding of how he'd done it. Elliott hadn't merely betrayed me. He'd reverse-engineered my career, everything I once did for clients' estate structures, transfer deeds, asset protections he'd learned from me. He'd watched me build trust frameworks and memorize the clauses. Then, quietly, he'd weaponized them against me. He hadn't married a partner. He'd married a blueprint. The irony made me laugh once, quietly, into my hands. When I left the law firm, I promised myself I'd never be one of those paralegals who buried themselves in other people's secrets. But here I was, living inside one engineered by the man who'd sworn to protect me. I forwarded the NDA to my private drive and encrypted it under a code phrase only Marion would recognize. Then I closed the laptop and stared at the city lights flickering through the curtains. I thought of the moment I'd signed Amendment 12C, how easily the pen had moved, how normal it had felt. Every con begins with familiarity. By sunrise. I decided two things. First, I wouldn't confront him not yet. Second, I would need allies who understood numbers better than emotion. If he wanted to play corporate chess, he'd forgotten I knew every square on the board. When he came down for breakfast, he kissed the top of my head. "You're quiet," he said lightly. "Just tired," I murmured, sliding a slice of toast onto his plate. He smiled, oblivious, humming as he scrolled through his phone. Across the kitchen island, the printed grant deed lay folded beneath my coffee cup, invisible to him. I looked at the man who had forged my signature and thought, almost tenderly, you should have chosen someone who didn't understand the law. Because now, every document you touched was becoming evidence, and every clause you wrote would soon testify against you. Some wars begin with noise, mine began with silence. After that night, the whisper through the study door, the forged trust, the phantom remodel I learned to move like a shadow in my own life. No confrontation, no accusations, only structure. Every betrayal has a paper trail. And I was going to follow his until it ended. Marion was my first call. She picked up before the first ring finished. "I've been waiting for this," she said flatly. "Start talking." I told her everything: the amendment, the wire, the whisper about clean assets. She didn't gasp or ask why I hadn't left yet. She only said, "We'll need forensics and someone with eyes on the inside." By noon, she'd assembled a quiet task force, 3 people, all discreet. Arjun Patel, a forensic accountant she'd worked with on a merger fraud case, sharp, methodical, the kind of man who could find missing money by its dust trail. Priya Niles, a private investigator specializing in OSINT online intelligence. If something existed on a server, she could find it. And Marion herself, quarterbacking the operation from her office overlooking Market Street, where the glass walls made every lie visible. We met after hours in a private conference room at her firm. Marion's tone was crisp. "We treat this like a hostile takeover. You're not his wife right now. You're the dissenting shareholder." Arjun leaned forward, fingers steepled. "First, we secure the data. Does he keep backups Verdant's server mirrors every 24 hours? I said. "But the local drives his desktop. His laptop, they hold versions he never submits to audit." Priya nodded. "We clone them quietly." "Do you have office access?" I smiled faintly. Still KOO, remember that weekend, while Elliot was at a leadership retreat in Big Sur. I walked into the Verdant offices with a confidence badge I'd worn for 5 years. Security nodded me through. My heels clicked across the marble, the sound echoing like a countdown. Inside his glass-walled office, everything was immaculate, no clutter, no emotion, only screens, Post-its. Precision. I plugged in a mirrored hard drive and began to copy. Folders unfolded like nesting dolls, LP side letters. Captable, Rev Thirkat, Ops Transition, Documents. One folder made my pulse spike. QO, Offboarding. I opened it. Slack transcripts scrolled across the screen. Gabe optics-wise. Maybe we announce her step down after the anniversary. Looks cleaner. Elliot. Exactly. We'll call it a strategic transition. Public loves a graceful exit. Comms. Do we prep a statement? Elliot draft something about her pursuing new ventures. Make it sound mutual. They'd planned my erasure like a quarterly update. I copied every file. When Arjun reviewed the mirrored drive later, his brow tightened. This isn't just PR. He's restructuring Verdant's equity. Look, cap table revision 3. He's shifting founder shares from Ward Dalton Holdings to Verdant B Trust. That's your half of the company, moved into a trust you don't control. I felt the word settle, heavy but clean. So he's laundering my equity under a family fund. Arjun nodded. Classic obfuscation. But sloppy. He left traces of both your names on internal drafts. If we can prove intent. This becomes criminal, not civil. Marion tapped her pen against the table. We'll need timing. When does he plan to execute? That answer came a few nights later. Priya found it hidden in a side letter between Elliot and a major limited partner, Westbridge Capital. The PDF, recovered from Verdant's internal drive, was dated 2 weeks before our anniversary. Clause 4.2 read, following the post-anniversary announcement regarding executive restructuring, we anticipate full leadership consolidation under Mr. Ward. Marian's eyes sharpened. Post-anniversary announcement. She exhaled slowly. He timed his humiliation of you to align with this disclosure. The personal breakup legitimizes the corporate one, so the toast wasn't personal. I said, "It was strategy." Priya smirked darkly. Weaponized marriage optics, brutal but efficient. The room fell quiet except for the hum of the city outside. I stood, crossed to the window, and looked down at Market Street glittering like a circuit board. He thinks he's untouchable, I said finally. He forgets I built the compliance framework he's abusing. Marian smiled the faint, lethal kind. Then let him walk into his own audit. Over the next week, we built a paper fortress. Arjun reconstructed the fund's transactions, mapping every diverted dollar through shell trusts. Priya scraped metadata, piecing together timestamps that aligned with my forged signature. Marian drafted memos addressed to regulators unsigned. For now, I played my part perfectly. At home, I was the calm wife again, polite, attentive, serene. I made his favorite lamb ragu, asked about his meetings, even pressed his shirts. He seemed pleased by my stability, the way abusers always are when control returns to their script. Then, when he asked me to sign a new notice of separation of duties for Verdant, I signed without hesitation. My pen stroke was deliberate, my smile impeccable. He thought it was submission. It was bait. Because buried in the notice was a clause referencing Section 7 of the COO Transition Agreement, a section he hadn't finalized yet. That meant he'd have to draft it next, leaving another trail. The next morning, Arjun found the new file already uploaded to Verdant's drive. He took it. He said over speakerphone, "Your fake clause forced him to attach a justification memo. He's now documented his own intent to remove you post-anniversary for fiduciary optics. We have proof. Proof." I hung up. Heart steady. Voice even. I still hosted dinners. I still showed up at the office. Elliot had no idea I'd built an invisible scaffolding under every conversation, every spreadsheet. He thought he was orchestrating an exit. He didn't realize he was already inside mine. And in less than 2 weeks on that rooftop, he would make his grand announcement, right on schedule. What he didn't know was that I'd already started writing his afterword. In every war, there's a moment when the enemy believes he's already won. Elliot's came wrapped in mahogany leather, our prenup. He'd built his confidence on it. I could see it in the way he moved through the house, lately relaxed. Superior. Humming Sinatra as he poured himself a drink. To him, every account transfer, every forged signature, every fake remodel invoice was a move backed by legal armor. He thought the prenup made him bulletproof. And to be fair, it almost did. I remember signing it years ago in a glass conference room overlooking the bay, back then. I thought it was just another formality, something his mother insisted on. For optics? Elliot had framed it as protection for us both, if anything ever goes wrong. We keep it clean, he'd said, touching my hand. He never mentioned the clause he didn't understand. Now, seated across from Marian at her office, I slid the prenup across the table like a piece of evidence. He thinks this saves him, I said. Tell me it doesn't. Marian, always composed, put on her glasses and began to read. The city reflected off the glass walls behind her gray, endless, indifferent. She flipped pages in silence, pen tapping lightly against the margin. Then her mouth curved, slow and deliberate. "Oh, Claire," she said. "He didn't read this as closely as he thinks." I leaned forward. "Explain." "Here." She pointed to Section 9.3 subclause. D. All assets transferred fraudulently during the course of marriage shall be deemed outside the protective scope of this agreement and subject to equitable restitution. I blinked. He insisted on using his mother's attorney. Marian smirked. Then she hired a mediocre one. They reused boilerplate language from a model prenup, but forgot to delete the carve-out. Congratulations. He just handed you your counterstrike. For a second. I said nothing. The irony was exquisite. Elliot had spent years weaponizing clauses. He'd never imagined one would turn on him. Marian's eyes skimmed the page, then stilled. "It's a carve-out." She said, "Fraud voids protection, and see this Section 11 arbitration. It lets us freeze him before he even knows he's cornered." Arjun, who had joined us by video, nodded. That timing's everything. The vendor escrow pattern Claire found, those identical withdrawals, they don't look like random vendor payments anymore. They're rhythmic, structured. It's classic laundering behavior disguised as operations expense. Marian leaned back. He used the remodel invoices as cover, but the invoices themselves create a paper trail. Each fake contractor, each shell LLC, it's evidence of fraudulent conveyance. Which, under your prenup, voids his protection. I looked at the screen where Arjun had pulled up the spreadsheet of transactions. Rows and columns of dates and dollar amounts marched like soldiers. Every vendor escrow transfer now looked less like bookkeeping and more like confession. He thought the invoices made him safe, I said quietly, but they actually prove intent. Marian smiled an elegant. Dangerous thing? Exactly. He built his own case file for us. The room hummed with the soft click of her pen. So, she continued, we hit him from two sides. You issue a trust protector notice to suspend his authority as trustee standard in cases of suspected mismanagement. Simultaneously, we prepare a temporary restraining order to freeze all asset transfers pending review. That locks the accounts before he can move another dollar offshore. I hesitated. He'll see it coming once we file. That's the point, Marian said. Let him feel the walls move. I nodded slowly. How soon can we start now? Within hours. Arjun had assembled the documentation screenshots, escrow records, the forged deed, the NDA with Levi Crane. Marian drafted the trust protector notice on her firm's letterhead, citing Section 14, fiduciary breach and fraudulent conveyance. I watched her type my name, beneficiary Claire Dalton Ward, hereby requests the temporary suspension of trustee authority held by Mr. Elliot Ward pending audit of Verdant Capital Trust. The language was calm, surgical, absolute, when she printed it. The paper was still warm. Deliver this through registered courier, Marian said. He'll receive it Monday morning. And by Monday afternoon, the banks will be frozen? I held the document in my hands. It was only a few paragraphs, but it carried the weight of 7 years of betrayal. That night, back in Pacific Heights, I moved through the house with deliberate stillness. Elliot sat by the fireplace, reviewing a term sheet on his laptop, completely at ease. You're quiet lately, he said. Glancing up. Just focused on the anniversary, I replied, pouring wine. He smiled, satisfied, and went back to his screen. I watched him in the amber light, the same hands that forged my name now scrolling through portfolios he believed untouchable. He had no idea that every keystroke, every click, was building the evidence file against him. I excused myself and walked to the study, locking the door behind me. On the desk lay the trust protector notice, folded neatly beside the courier envelope. I placed my signature at the bottom, slow and steady, when I sealed it. I felt something shift, not relief, not revenge, precision. Outside. The city glowed faintly under fog, and the clock struck midnight. In 24 hours. His empire would pause. He believed the prenup was his shield. He didn't know it was my sword, and by the time he realized, the bank lines would already be cold, the trust frozen mid-transfer, the board whispering about audits. He'd built his fortress out of paper. All I had to do was read it. The evening smelled of rain and money. The Fairmont's terrace glowed gold under the mist. Waiters glided through the crowd with trays of champagne. A live quartet played something elegant and forgettable. Cameras flashed as guests drifted between conversation and gossip. It was, on the surface, a celebration of 7-year anniversary for Verdant Capital and the couple who built it together. Elliot's idea. Of course. The perfect optics. A charity event disguised as devotion, LPs, board members, journalists all gathered to toast the visionary partnership of the Wards. I stood beside him, wrapped in emerald silk, the city glittering behind us. My clutch was small, sleek, almost weightless except for the single document folded inside trust agreement, Amendment 17B. The ink was still sharp from the printer. Marian had made sure of it. Elliot's hand rested lightly on my waist as photographers snapped photos. To anyone watching, we looked seamless. The perfect brand. Smile. He whispered through his teeth. Tonight's about the fund, not us. I smiled. Not for him, for the record. The speeches began. Investors praised transparency, impact, vision, each word stacked like bricks around his ego. The champagne hummed through the air when it was his turn. Elliot stepped onto the small stage, the city lights reflecting off his cufflinks. "Thank you. Everyone," he began, his voice smooth, rehearsed. "Verdant started as a dream between two people. And tonight, I want to honor that journey, our triumphs, our evolution, and our growth. Applause." The PR manager beamed. Margot, his mother, dabbed at the corner of her eye with a linen napkin. Then Elliot's tone shifted, almost imperceptibly. "Every partnership evolves," he said, glancing at me. "And sometimes, clarity means realizing which chapters have served their purpose." A ripple went through the audience, half curiosity, half discomfort. The jazz stopped mid-note. He looked directly at me, his voice steady, cold. "If I could redo one thing," he said, "I wouldn't marry you." It wasn't anger. It was declaration, pre-planned, deliberate, a public erasure. For a long moment, the world held its breath. Glass stems trembled. Someone laughed too softly, unsure if it was a joke. Then silence fell like velvet thick, total, merciless. I felt every camera shift toward me. I saw Margot's smile fracture. I heard the ocean of whispers building, and I felt nothing. I turned to face him. His expression was smug, certain, as if this humiliation were the final keystroke on his clean exit, but I hadn't come unarmed. I opened my clutch. The silk rustled faintly as I pulled out the document, 5 pages folded once, the header glinting under the terrace lights, Verdant Capital Trust, Amendment 17B. The microphone was still warm in his hand when I reached for it. He blinked, confused. As I lifted it slowly, my voice was calm. "Since we're talking about clarity," I said, "perhaps the guests should hear the clause you forgot to mention." The crowd turned, hungry. I unfolded the paper, smoothed it against my palm, and read 3 lines. Precise and unforgiving. Upon demonstration of trustee fraud, beneficiary status reverts retroactively. The trust protector may instruct all financial institutions to freeze distributions pending review. All fraudulent transfers are null and void ab initio. The wind caught the last words, scattering them into silence. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a glass shattered somewhere behind us. Margot's hand slipped. Champagne spilled down her sequined sleeve. Elliot's face drained of color. "Claire," he said quietly, "this isn't the place." "On the contrary," I replied, "it's exactly the place. You made it public." Cameras began flashing again, this time frantic. Reporters angled forward, phones recording. The board members looked at each other, uncertain, calculating. I stepped closer, just enough for him to see the reflection of the claws in my eyes. "You forgot the retroactive part." "Elliot." Then I handed the microphone back, turned, and walked off the platform. The silence that followed was louder than applause. As I passed through the crowd, I heard fragments retroactive fraud freeze and the faint click of text messages being sent. By the time I reached the elevator, half the terrace was on their phones, upstairs, through the glass doors. I glimpsed chaos beginning to ripple outward, LPs retreating into the side room reserved for strategic discussions, the PR manager pale, headset pressed to her ear, Gabe the CFO leaning hard against the balcony rail, staring at his phone, and Elliot, still on the stage, gripping the microphone like a drowning man clinging to metal, in the elevator mirror. I looked perfectly composed, my pulse steady. The paper, now folded back into my clutch, carried more weight than any diamond ring. By the time I stepped into the car waiting downstairs, my phone was already vibrating. Marian's voice came through, crisp as glass. "Claire," she said, "it's done. The banks confirmed receipt of the trust protector notice an hour ago. They're freezing distributions as we speak." I looked out at the lights spilling over Nob Hill. Then he's learning what retroactive really means. At the Fairmont rooftop, panic was spreading like perfume. The investors our audience were whispering in corners, checking balances. Verdant's PR director was ushering people toward the exit, murmuring about technical miscommunication. Margot demanded her car. Reporters were already drafting headlines. The story Elliot had choreographed, a perfect celebration of partnership and power, was unraveling in real time. And as the doors of the elevator closed behind me, I realized something with a clarity that almost felt like peace. He had built his entire empire on perception. I had just turned perception into evidence. The city glittered below. Unaware that a silent storm had begun, one written not in emotion, but in clauses. And while he scrambled to control the narrative, I simply let the paper speak. By dawn the next morning, the city headlines had already sharpened VC power couple implodes at rooftop gala. Elliot's name trended for all the wrong reasons. Mine appeared in every second paragraph, calm, composed, untouchable, while the internet chewed on speculation. I moved quietly through what came next. Revenge. For me. Wasn't fire. It was architecture. The first step was execution, not emotion. Step 1. The freeze. By 8 circuits a.m., Marion's courier had already delivered the protector instruction to Verdant's primary banking institution's North Bay Trust, Silver Lake Investments, and their offshore correspondent branches, the letter. Dense and dry. Cited Section 17B of the trust agreement, the clause I had read aloud the night before. All distributions, transfers, or withdrawals executed under the authority of Trustee Elliot Ward are to be suspended pending audit of fiduciary integrity. In simpler terms, wire freeze. It was a small phrase with devastating reach. Every transaction from his accounts, domestic or foreign, halted midstream. Elliot's empire didn't crumble with drama. It simply stopped moving. At 8:17 a.m., his assistant sent a panicked text Elliot. Bank flagged outgoing transfers compliance hold. At 8:20, investor line, blowing up should I issue statement. At 8:25, silence. Money moves faster than gossip. But not when the clause says otherwise. Step 2. The escrow. I met Arjun at his office walls lined with framed balance sheets from cases he'd dismantled like puzzles. He slid a folder toward me. We've set up an escrow at Pacific Fidelity. All pending proceeds from the Verdant B Trust sale will flow there under a dispute holdback clause. Legally airtight. Meaning, I asked, meaning he can't touch a cent until the arbitration closes, if he tries. He risks violating both the prenup and securities law. It's containment disguised as procedure. I signed the instruction letter, initials precise and steady. He smiled. You've officially outlawyered a venture capitalist? Step 3. The proxy. Marion's office handled that one with surgical grace. Using relationships she'd cultivated during the merger years, she reached out to the limited partners, the LPs, who'd once toasted to our marriage. Most of them are furious about the optics, she said over the phone. Elliot humiliated his wife at a fundraising gala, then got his assets frozen. They care less about morality and more about stability. You offer them that. We drafted a proxy vote authorization to temporarily suspend CEO authority pending fiduciary review and designate interim chairperson. 3 LPs signed within hours. 2 more called me directly cautious, diplomatic. Claire, we don't want drama. One said, neither do I. I replied, just governance. By the end of the day, I held 54% of proxy representation, enough to trigger an emergency board vote. Step 4, the referral. It was Marion's idea to take it federal. She coordinated with a white-collar counsel, filing 2 criminal referrals, one to IRS CI for tax evasion and fraudulent conveyance, and another to the FBI Financial Crimes Division for identity forgery and wire fraud. The package included the forged e-signature, the fake vendor invoices, and the NDA referencing spousal dilution. Once the agencies received this, Marion said, he's no longer just a bad husband. He's a case number. I stared at the cover page, where his full name sat in black ink, Elliot Jonathan Ward. Underneath, my own filed by beneficiary and co-founder Claire Dalton Ward. Justice didn't need anger. It needed paper. That night. I went home not to the house in Pacific Heights, but to the shell of it. The place was still, as if waiting for its next owners. The walls smelled faintly of the lilies from the party, now browning in the vase. I moved from room to room collecting only essentials documents, jewelry from my grandmother, 2 photographs, 1 worn leather notebook, everything else dresses, trays, suits belonged to another life. I called Samantha Rhodes, a real estate agent known for discretion, I need the house listed quietly, I said. Private showing, vetted buyers only, cash preferred. Understood, she said without surprise. Trust sale? I smiled. You could say that. Within 48 hours, she had 2 offers. I accepted the one that didn't ask questions. By the weekend, I'd moved into a short-term apartment in North Beach, overlooking the bay. The space was small, minimalist bare walls, clean light, one window facing the water. The quiet felt earned. In the evenings, I'd sit with a cup of mint tea and read through Marion's latest updates. The calm wasn't peace, it was calculation settling into rhythm. One line from her email made me pause. Board wants to schedule an emergency session. We can use it. That became the next move the trap. Marion drafted the notice herself. Extraordinary board meeting, purpose review of CEO conduct and investor relations optics. The word optics was his. It would draw him in. We made sure it landed on his calendar, sent by Gabe, the ever-loyal CFO who had quietly switched sides once he realized the FBI was involved. He won't resist, Marion said. He'll think he can charm his way back. I looked out the window at the fog curling over the bay. Good, I said softly. Let him come. The plan was simple record everything. The moment he admitted that the announcement at the gala was an optics move, not a genuine separation, it would establish intent. A public humiliation engineered for financial gain textbook fraud. And once that admission sat in the meeting, minutes. Notarized and timestamped. His credibility would collapse faster than his liquidity. I closed Marion's email and leaned back. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in the apartment. Outside. The city blinked, unaware that a new kind of storm was gathering, not made of gossip or rage, but of filings, freezes, and signatures. The kind that doesn't destroy buildings, it destroys reputations. By Monday morning. Elliot Ward would walk into his own meeting believing he was regaining control. He didn't know it yet. But the boardroom was already wired. The minute he opened his mouth, the final evidence would write itself. And this time, he wouldn't be able to edit the narrative. The boardroom smelled like nerves and cologne. Verdant's marble conference table stretched beneath a halo of light, the city skyline glimmering through glass walls behind it. Every chair was filled LPs, advisors, attorneys. The hum of whispered speculation buzzed like an electrical current. I stepped inside, wearing a white suit, crisp, deliberate, the kind of white that absorbs nothing. Elliot was already seated at the head of the table, his tie loosened, his smile performative. He looked up when I entered. For a second, his expression flickered shock, maybe fear, but he covered it quickly. Claire, he said smoothly, you didn't have to come. This is a board matter. I set my folder on the table. I am the board matter, Marion, beside me, opened her laptop and connected it to the screen. The Verdant logo flickered, then dissolved into a flowchart of transactions' clean lines, red arrows, and dollar amounts. At the top, vendor escrow accounts. At the bottom, offshore subtrust, Verdant B. A slow murmur rippled through the room. This, Marion began, her voice professional and controlled, is the routing of Verdant's last 6 months of transfers, labeled as vendor payments. Each path ultimately leads to one beneficiary entity, Elliot Ward Holdings, LLC. She clicked again. The screen zoomed in on a signature block. My name, my forged name, the e-signature, she continued, was generated through a template file Elliot used for board approvals. Forensic analysis confirms forgery indicators, inconsistent pixel compression, mismatched timestamp metadata, and an IP address traceable to Verdant's internal system. A silence thickened. Elliot's jaw tightened. That's absurd, he said. Those were delegated approvals, clerical automation. Marion didn't flinch. Then explained the pressure emails, at her cue, the CFO, Gabe, adjusted his tie and pulled up another file. Elliot sent these personally, he said. His voice trembled slightly, but grew steadier as he read aloud. Push the invoices through under Claire's name. Optics are everything until we announce her offboarding. The room turned colder. The independent counsel, an older attorney appointed by the LPs, leaned forward. Mr. E. R. Nees Ward, did you authorize use of your spouse's signature for these transactions? Elliot opened his mouth, then closed it. The pause said everything. Off the record. He tried. We were resolving internal misalignments on the record. The counsel corrected sharply. Answered directly. He said nothing. The same people who once toasted us now avoided his eyes. One LP, a woman from New York who'd flown in overnight, whispered to another, "This is catastrophic." Marion clicked again. The next slide was a single sentence, projected in sharp white letters, upon demonstration of trustee fraud. Beneficiary status reverts retroactively. The anniversary clause. No music, no applause, just law. Then came the knock. 2 agents IRS criminal investigation and FBI financial crimes entered with calm authority, badges gleaming under the recessed lights. "Mr. E. Ward," the lead agent said, "we have a federal warrant for record seizure under U.S. Yo Code Pierwa 343 wire fraud and Mayor 7206 false statements." The color drained from Elliot's face as he stood. Trying to salvage dignity? "You can't do this here," he muttered. "This is here." The agent replied. They handed copies of the warrant to the independent counsel and Marion, then began collecting devices: his laptop, his phone, his external drives. The agent's movements were quiet, methodical, almost polite. Outside the boardroom glass, reporters were already gathering. Somehow the news had leaked, perhaps through one of the LPs, perhaps by design. While the agents worked, the counsel addressed the table. Until further notice, Mr. Ward's executive authority is suspended pending outcome of the federal investigation. Effective immediately. Mrs. Yes? Claire Dalton Ward assumes interim control as acting CEO. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. Elliot stared at me, 1,000 unspoken calculations flickering behind his eyes. "You set this up," he said softly. "You think this makes you righteous, no?" I said. Steady. "It makes me accurate." Marion handed the counsel the signed proxy authorization, confirming the majority LP vote. Everything was documented. Every move legal, procedural, irreversible. The gavel fell figuratively, not literally, and the meeting adjourned in stunned silence. Outside, the hallway smelled faintly of printer ink and rain. Elliot followed me out, escorted by the agents for a brief second. Our eyes met through the reflection on the glass wall. 7 years together, and this was the first time he looked small. He whispered as they led him away. "You'll regret this," I replied quietly. "I already did. That's why it's over." By afternoon, the federal injunction had landed a preliminary freeze order on all Verdant accounts and subtrusts. The press release was sterile, bloodless, and devastating. Effective immediately. Verdant Capital is under federal review for fiduciary misconduct. Interim leadership established. Ongoing cooperation with authorities. The market reacted within hours. LPs stabilized once they learned restitution was in progress. Under court order. I regained 50% equity and restitution rights from the fraudulent trust transfers. It wasn't just about money. It was about precision, about the record being corrected. That evening, as I exited the courthouse, the air was sharp with salt and camera flashes. Reporters crowded the steps, shouting over each other. One voice broke through. "Mrs. Ward? Do you feel vindicated?" I paused at the bottom step. The sky behind me was the same pewter gray as the rooftop night months ago. I looked at the reporter calm, clear, and answered, "I don't feel vindicated. I feel precise." The line hung in the air, clipped, clean. Flashbulbs went off. The quote would run on every financial page the next morning, beneath headlines about trust collapses and forensic victories. But for me, it wasn't triumph. It was calibration. The final note of a symphony written in clauses and signatures. Justice didn't roar. It resonated quietly, surgically, in perfect rhythm with the law. 1 year later, the headlines had faded. The city had moved on to new scandals, new founders, new funds, new collapses. Verdant Capital existed now only as a case study in Forensic Finance 302 at Stanford when trust becomes liability. And me, I had become something else entirely. Ethos Trust Advisory opened quietly on a fog-swept Monday in downtown Monterey. No marble plaques, no elevator pitches, just a steel door etched with 3 words: trust, equity, clarity, trust, equity, clarity, inside. Sunlight streamed through large windows onto oak desks stacked with files labeled Prenup Review, Marital Trust Audit, Founder Spousal Equity Workshop, Most of my clients were women CFOs, engineers, artists, widows, each carrying a story that began with the same sentence: I didn't know what I was signing. I never lectured. I translated. I taught them what carve-out really meant, what a spousal waiver could hide, why a signature deserved more than trust, it deserved time. Every Tuesday, I hosted free workshops at the Carmel Public Library. No slides, no jargon, just coffee, highlighters, and case studies. The front row was always full retirees next to MBA students, young wives next to CEOs. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of myself in them before the rooftop, before the claws. The woman who believed intelligence was enough protection. And sometimes, after sessions, a student would whisper, I watched your hearing on YouTube. You looked so calm. I'd smile and tell them the truth. Calm is a decision you practice. My home in Carmel by the sea was a small white cottage overlooking the Pacific. The air smelled of cypress and salt. Every morning I ran along the coastline before sunrise, the wind clean against my face, marking distance from the past. I kept no trophies, no framed headlines, no reminders. Just one photograph on my desk, the Fairmont rooftop at dusk, the moment before the silence, a reminder not of pain, but of precision. Marion still called every Friday from LA, always with the same greeting. You caused another clause revolution this week. Didn't you? Arjun occasionally sent updates on cases where he'd applied our trust transparency model to corporate audits. Even Gabe resurfaced, now teaching ethics in venture finance. We had all been changed, recalibrated. Then, one afternoon, a courier arrived at Ethos with a small envelope cream, heavy stock, stamped with a Swiss postmark. Inside a single folded page and a banker's insignia embossed in silver. Crane Family Trust. Beneficiary notice. Below. My name. Claire Dalton Ward. And at the bottom, in fine print, appointed by trustee Levi Crane, Levi Elliott's former partner, the same man who had drafted the fraudulent NDA, the one who vanished overseas during the investigation. For a moment, I simply stared at it. The room was silent except for the low hum of the espresso machine. Beneficiary notice, not accusation, not demand. Invitation. Was it a trap, an offshore attempt to implicate me in another laundering scheme? A silent bribe to keep his name buried, or something else entirely, an encrypted confession hidden in the legal framework? Only I would understand. I placed the letter under the desk lamp and studied it again. Every comma precise. Every date too neat. The trust's effective date 2 months after Elliott's conviction. The jurisdiction Zurich. The beneficiary name mine. I folded the letter carefully back into its envelope, locked it in the cabinet, and exhaled. For the first time in a year, I felt the pulse of unfinished business. That night, I walked to the shore. The moon painted silver lines across the black water, somewhere behind me. My life waited structured, peaceful, precise, ahead of me. The sea kept its own secrets. I thought of Elliott, still serving his sentence, drafting motions he'd never win. I thought of Levi Crane, the man who might still believe he could manipulate the law the way Elliott once did. And I thought of myself no longer the wife or the victim or even the survivor, just the architect of my own clauses. Maybe this was another beginning. Maybe this was a warning. Maybe both. I turned back toward the cottage lights and whispered to the ocean, I'm not afraid of paper anymore. 2 weeks later, after credit scene. A new email arrived in my inbox. Subject line blank. No sender, no signature, only one attachment, a 24-second video. I hesitated, then pressed play. The footage was grainy but clear enough rooftop lighting, golden champagne glow, voices muffled under jazz. And there, on screen, Margot Ward Elliott's mother leaning close to the PR manager minutes before the toast. Her voice, crisp through the static. Make sure the photographers stay for the speech. It needs to look spontaneous? The PR woman nodded, then the clip cut off. I sat still. The cursor blinking like a heartbeat on the screen. Margot had known. The speech wasn't impulsive, it was staged. A performance choreographed to ruin me. Pre-approved by family optics. I closed the laptop slowly. Some wars end quietly. Others simply change jurisdictions. Some wars end quietly. If you were in Claire's position, would you forgive? Or fight back again? Leave your thoughts below.